Good morning, everyone. Thanks for coming to Grand Rounds, Medicine Grand Rounds. People are still jumping on, but it looks like we have a good number here. And we have a terrific Grand Rounds for you today. And so I will turn it over to Dr. Bierkens to introduce Dr. Hess.
Hey, good morning, everyone, and welcome to our first Grand Rounds of Black History Month. We are lucky today to be joined by Dr. Leona Hess, the Senior Director of Strategy and Equity Education here at the Icahn School of Medicine at Mount Sinai. Before joining us in 2018, Dr. Hess got her bachelor's from George Washington, a master's in social work from NYU, and her PhD at Columbia. At both Columbia and CUNY, she thereafter taught on contemporary social issues, focusing on systems of oppression such as racism, sexism, heterocentrism, and others. Here at Mount Sinai, she has been leading a transformational process to develop the capacity of leaders, staff, and students to dismantle racism. She has taught courses focusing on the social and structural determinants of health, structural competency, and anti-racism pedagogy. In 2021, with grant funding from the Josiah Macy Jr. Foundation, she became the co-principal investigator of the Anti-Racist Transformation in Medical Education program that aims to develop the capacity of 11 medical schools across the country and Canada, with the goal to replicate Mount Sinai's transformational change process addressing racism. We are excited to have her here today and learn from a true transformative educator. Welcome, Dr. Hess.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me. And hi, everybody. It's great to see some faces that I know and some new faces. So excited to be here today. No disclosures that I have. In terms of the learning objectives or the goal for today is really to describe ways that racism is embedded in academic medicine, to identify the differences between linear and systems thinking, and also to define the three major types of change. And then, of course, I wanted to leave today with being able to present some transformational change practices that can be used in your wards with your teaching teams or with anyone really, so that there are real things that you can do today. As I go through my presentation, I really invite you to pay attention to what's coming up for you. So for some, this might be really aligned with your worldview, your feelings about addressing racism. For others, this might be a paradigm shift. And then others are somewhere in the middle, right? And so I really invite everyone to pay attention to what's coming up. Where do you find signs of feeling like, yes, this resonates for me, this seems really aligned, this is something that I want to do, all the way to, I'm becoming really defensive, this is not true, or I want to disagree in these ways. And so I think just paying attention to those things, especially when we have Q&A, we should talk about that as well. So just as an invitation for all of you as we proceed. So the question is not if racism exists, it's how it's manifesting in academic medicine. And I wanted to spend just a little bit of time just providing a little bit of an overview of some key points. And so I do think, and this is a perspective that came out recently, which looked at representation, so racial and ethnic representation in surgical and non-surgical residency programs. So it has not substantially improved over the past decade, and it really continues to lag behind the demographic characteristics and trends that we see in the US population. So right from jump, representation is already indicating that there's manifestations of racism even up until this point, right? In terms of how is it experienced, or the experience of minority resident physicians based on their role, the role of race and ethnicity in terms of their training experience. And the respondents of this study identified a daily barrage of microaggressions, bias, discrimination. Also that the minority residents were tasked with being what's called, or what they identified as, race or ethnicity ambassadors. And this is really taking on the additional work, maybe additional clinical hours. It's fixing the problems related to diversity. Maybe it's serving as experts, right, of racial and ethnic issues. And then, of course, the challenges of negotiating professional and personal identities while being seen as other in the environment. just a little bit of other experiences. And I think that this highlights on the left-hand side, those are the top 4 domains of frequently were expressed from this sample of physicians of color in healthcare settings. And, this notion or feeling of being excluded, either for leadership advancement or being overlooked. And, the assumptions or discounted their abilities and their stereotypes. And I think it's important to note here that this is longitudinally. It didn't just start happening in residency, but in fact, they've experienced it throughout UME and perhaps into GME, right? And we could probably even, go into undergrad, right? And so that those assumptions that longitudinally that experience also held at higher standards, right? The automatic assumption that the education was less quality because of their race or maybe English as their second language. And then, of course, microaggressions, which we have talked about before. Then when we start looking at the experience of Black residents being believed that they had fewer chances to make mistakes than their white counterparts, leading to many to doubt themselves and to be on guard all of the time. And this is what's called, or in 2006, what's called the open secret of attrition of Black residents. So not only is it experience, but the impact of attrition over time. And of course, on the right-hand side, we see more contemporary data on, while Black residents account for about 5% of all residents, they accounted nearly for 20% of those dismissed in 2015. Then when we look into specialty, I don't think that this is any kind of new information for folks, but maybe, more of a recent survey found that almost 25% had experienced discrimination because of their race, ethnicity, or maybe their religion, with the highest among Black residents, right? And so these trends is what we're seeing in the manifestations. And these are just some examples, right? And then when we talk about the barriers to either achieving diversity among faculty and leadership positions in academic health centers, that we're often plagued with this notion of minority gratitude and loyalty taxes, imposter syndrome, distance traveled, or power distance, which is found in hierarchical structures, defaulting to those with power, as being the decision makers, and the interlocking barriers of all of these things. So an increase in minority gratitude and loyalty tax increases imposter syndrome, right? Or the distance traveled, or that are the experiences up until their current position, perhaps imposter syndrome played a role, right? Or power distance. So again, there's these barriers that prevent from faculty of color being in leadership positions. And so a lot of the existing initiatives for underrepresented faculty have largely focused on the individual faculty development or resilience. And so less attention has been paid to transforming, right, the environment itself. So that really leads us to the question, now what? Right? Hopefully many of you are saying, okay, so that's the data. We know this. For some of you, we're like, we know it, I experience it, or I've seen it, or I've witnessed it, we know it, but now what? And often the answer is that I find is, let's fix the problem, right? And so this really has led us in medical education through this process and journey of saying, but wait a minute, what are we fixing? What is the problem, right? And why do we have this particular lens in thinking about identifying a problem and fixing it? Right? This notion that it's linear or that there's causation, right? And so this is traditionally, physician leaders have depended on reasoning and logic sequencing, this type of thinking to solve institutional problems. This is no mistake. It makes sense, right? Because when we look at UME and GME education, it goes through this processing reasoning. So one, there's this depth of knowledge. We reward depth of knowledge. We're even organized in terms of specialty, right? It produces physicians who are capable of making correct decisions under ambiguous circumstances, which lends to a rigorous development of analytical and sequential thought processes, which then enable the literature-supported evidence-based decisions. That is the foundation of UME and GME medical training, right? And so there are benefits to that, right? There's scientific research that can be produced from this rigid development of analytical and sequential thought processes. There is further advancement of medical and scientific disciplines. But when it comes to solving complex social problems in particular, in very complex environments, it may impede the physician's ability to do that. And so then that really employs us to think about, even in your own clinical practice, it's unpredictable, it's complex. It isn't just linear and fixed and sequential and logical, right? The cause and effect are often not linked, right? And so like an example of is this particular study, it had, a linear perspective that home-based medical review after discharge would decrease hospital readmission rates, right? And the opposite was found. The intervention was associated with significant higher rates of hospital admissions. It did not significantly improve the quality of life or reduce death, right? And so in our environments, it's complex. It isn't very cause and effect sometimes. So despite the complexity of a healthcare system, we often appear to treat problems and issues in simple, linear terms. So what happens if the quote unquote problem is social and complex in a complex environment? That the path of that linear path is not going to get us there, right? That perhaps thinking more laterally in our thinking with multiple different paths, with multiple ways of seeing things and approaching it. And so this is a comparison, a table comparing vertical thinking and lateral thinking, right? Vertical thinking is very linear, lateral is not. It can be cyclical, it can be looking at different interconnections. In terms of patterns, that vertical thinking really develops an existing pattern. It's that very linear sequential, A plus B equals C. With lateral thinking, maybe we're trying to restructure an existing pattern. We're looking at D, E, F, G, right? Maybe with vertical, it's stepwise and methodological. Maybe it's multidimensional and creative. In terms of uncertainty, lateral thinking supports uncertainty. Linear thinking, you cannot have uncertainty. It has to be predictable. The depth of knowledge compared to the breadth of knowledge, restricted to relevant information, right? Think about research. You want to control for all the other variables. Lateral will allow more to come in. It's not restrictive to information. Novel approaches are welcomed, right? So when we think about applying this, these are some examples in a spectrum of vertical to lateral thinking. What requires most vertical thinking, traditional medical training, all the way to what requires most lateral thinking, which I want to just, focus the attention on developing disruptive innovations. In order to address racism or any system of social oppression or the matrix of oppression, we must develop disruptive innovations. It's not just fixing the problem, because that's treating the symptom and often makes us really busy, but doesn't get to the root of where the problem lies. So when we consider racism, the reason why we perhaps need to employ different thinking and different practices opposed to this linear, stepwise, identify a problem, fix it, is because racism in itself is also deeply complex. It is internalized. It's our race-based beliefs and feelings within individuals. It's how we have been racialized, especially in this country, if you were born and raised here. There's interpersonal, there's institutional through policies and practices. There's systemic in terms of maintaining the social systems across the board. And then, of course, there's cultural racism, which is based on the notion of white culture as standard and superior. Right? So it's full dimensions, which makes it quite complex. And so the conventional or linear thinking is not suited for addressing complex chronic social problems, especially in complex adaptive systems. And so we want to move to more systems thinking. And some of you have maybe already employed systems thinking in your practice, or that you know about systems thinking. It is looking at the parts, not just the parts, but the parts in the whole. It's the trees and the forest, and how the trees are interconnected and interdependent. And we want to be able to understand that and identify those various layers, not just the cause and effect, right? Because it's way more complex in our environment, because our environment is nonlinear. It flows in structure. It's chaotic and dynamic. There's diversity, there's connectivity, there's relational things, there are networks. You know, when you really want to try to get something done, you go to the person who perhaps can get that done in the network and to maybe move that forward, right? And that person may not be the person that has been identified. You know that through your networks, through your relationships. It's multidisciplinary, it's nested systems. So we have different departments, different units, different specialties, it's all nested. It's top down and bottom up causality. Even in hierarchical structures, it's historical, it's unpredictable. There are simple rules with complex outcomes. It's self-reinforcing mechanisms. There's feedback loops that produce positive and negative behavioral change. It's emergent behavior. It's iterative, right? So our systems are so complex. So when we think about systems thinking, it allows us, and this is what's on the right-hand side, to really move from this linear thinking. So I also want to acknowledge this. Often when I present this, people are like, but we can't get rid of linear thinking. Because what about, it's really important. Yes, linear thinking. Part of this is to develop, I like to say, the muscle, to know when to employ what type of thinking. So it's not either or, it's and in both. How can we develop the muscle when we want to address racism and other complex social problems? How can we activate a practice of systems thinking and not rely on our linear vertical thinking that we have been indoctrinated into, right? And so we want to acknowledge that the institution is unpredictable and often a chaotic environment. We're not trying to control that. We want to look at the relationships between problems, and their causes are indirect and not obvious. It is not A plus B equals C. We're concerned with the whole, not just the parts. We're concerned with underlying dynamics. What are the patterns? What are the structures? What are the mental models? What are the institutional and cultural values? We're concerned with identifying those patterns, right? We try to find patterns amidst the chaos so that we can then disrupt those patterns or the structures or our mental models, which is our worldview and thinking that is often unconscious. Right? It's concerned with the process, the how. It's not just the what. Often when I go in and I ask folks, so why do we want to, how are we going to address this problem? People are like, we need a training, or we just need to increase the diversity of this fill in the blank. And we start focusing on the what, a product or an action or an event. And I'm like, well, wait a minute. That's actually, how do we engage people, collaborate, produce feedback loops, course corrections, so that we can figure out what's really underneath? Because a training by itself at best, is fixing a symptom. And often the trainings, because they're box trainings, don't really get to what the underlying problems are. So often people are like, well, we didn't really see an effect. And I'm like, yes, I know, because we're actually not getting to the roots of where we need to go. So what's interesting with this, so sometimes people are like, this is so much work, Leona. I don't know. This is such a paradigm shift, or maybe does this produce more work? And I just want to mention the last line briefly before we move on, is that you can often find some key coordinated changes that are sustained over time that really can produce large systems change. It isn't about being busy or what we call in medical education, the whack-a-mole, where it's like, oh, problem, react, address that. Problem, react, address that. Problem, react, address that, right? And so it is a different orientation to what is considered the work. Now, you always have to have some type of response or mechanism. When an egregious event or things happen, you have to be able to respond to that. And where will you place a lot of your energy, your work in addressing racism? It's not necessarily the whack-a-mole. We can get really busy. So what kind of change then do we want to align ourselves to address racism? And so I just wanted to highlight the 3 different types of change. I know when I first kind of was introduced to this, it really helped me right size the expectation of what it would really change to address racism, right? And so often we think of developmental change. This is what improves a previously established process or procedure. This is normally what happens in our institutions. We identify something that is maybe not as effective or efficient, or a process that needs to be tweaked, changed. We implement that intervention or the action, or we change it, or we redesign it, and then to the process or procedure. And then we start to see, maybe it becomes a little bit more efficient. And so that's developmental change. And then often we're faced with transitional change, right? That moves an organization away from its current state to a new state in order to solve a problem. You can think about this as examples of mergers and acquisitions of hospitals, right? There's an old state, you go through a transition state, then there's a new state, or perhaps there is things like when there's a COVID surge, and a lot of folks needed to work remotely. We had new tech. Maybe people had to move to different platforms, or maybe there was hybrid teams. I know in medical education, we have hybrid teams. And so that was the old state of how it was pre-COVID. We went through a transitional phase, and now there's this new state of what it means to work and learn in an environment, right? Transformational change, when we think about this, is really radically and fundamentally alters, the culture and operation of an organization. It's the transformational change. The end result might not be known. And so for some, this is very anxiety producing, right? So you're like, wait a minute, but we want to address racism. What do you mean the end result? We might not know it. And so if we want to become anti-racist, or have health equity, or, have diversity, equity, and inclusion embedded in our institutions, we actually don't know what that really looks like fully yet. So part of it is that there's this birth of energy and momentum towards we need to change. Then there's growth. Maybe we start implementing something, which leads to maybe a successful plateau where we're like, yep, we're doing this well, this is really great. And then all of a sudden, because it's a complex environment, there becomes chaos, breakdowns, and wake-up calls. And through this process of breakdowns, chaos, wake-up calls, we begin to shift throughout time and reemerge to something new. And that something new we may not know. And so part of this is to develop the capacity to tolerate the chaos wake-up calls. Most institutions, we don't have a collective capacity to really tolerate it well. It becomes problem, fix it, get rid of it. Problem, fix it, let's not talk about it. Or that's blame, right? Opposed to saying, actually, that breakdown is part of our process to get to a better place, right? So when we think about then the tools that you can use, so I also have lots of methodology on how to change systems and institutions, but I wanted to bring to you concrete things that you can do, practices that you can employ that are aligned with more transformational change and different types of what's called creative thinking, which is under the umbrella of lateral and systems thinking. So I want to focus on 3 different practices. The first one is engaging in more lateral thinking. The second one is systems thinking, or using systems thinking through your processes and your in your clinical learning environments, and also moving from blame to accountability. And I'm going to talk about that last. So the first one, I don't know if anyone knows Dr. Ed DeBono, the very old physician who, or I like to say the godfather of the thinking is a skill. And he really fundamentally believed that lateral thinking is so important to embed. It's also really finding creative solutions by questioning the status quo. And so, again, we're trained, most of us are trained with more vertical thinking. Begin problem with existing knowledge, sequential logical thinking process is used for a single answer is generated, right? That's the diagnosis, right? More lateral thinking, you begin the problem with existing knowledge, you brainstorm or form associations with the problem, and you have multiple solutions are generated, right? So in your environment, when you want to address racism, or maybe you want to focus on it, how can you create opportunities for people to brainstorm, form associations with the problem, and not make it so discrete or coming to one solution? It's going to take a lot of different types of solutions in order to address whatever is happening, that event that is showing. So obtain a diversity of voices and perspectives and really center those most affected, right? And this is the notion of centering on the margins. People who are racial and ethnic minorities in predominantly white institutions know where the problem is because we're experiencing it, trust it, believe it, it's happening, right? And so part of this is ensuring that we're getting voice and perspective so that you can have a deeper analysis of what needs to be addressed. It isn't just that event, it's way more complex. And this is where the systems thinking come into play. Often we spend a lot of time reacting to events, what happened, debating what happened, saying that maybe this is my interpretation. Oh, this is your interpretation. These are the interpretations of what happened. We react to events. But are we capturing information about the patterns and trends that are happening, that are the continuous events that have not been addressed and continue to happen? We often know what those are, but we don't necessarily track it in terms of data. And I think the data that I presented early are some of the patterns and trends that are happening in residency, that are happening in our clinical learning environments. And then what are the underlying structures? What's influencing these patterns? What are the relationships, the policies, the distribution of resources, the job roles, the responsibilities, the physical space that is contributing to those patterns? And then we're going even deeper, right? What are the conscious and unconscious thoughts and beliefs that are holding those assumptions that affect how we make sense of the world, drive behavior in people, and keep those structures in place? It is our mental models that are keeping those structures in place. So how can we unpack and reveal what those are so that maybe we can shift some of those, we can really address? Also, the cultural and institutional values. What are the core beliefs and values that are within the department, within the institution, within different roles or groups of people? And how are they embedded in our cultural and in our culture and institution? And how do they make up our worldview? Right. So look to seek understanding of the potential causes, not just this is the problem, let's fix the problem, right? Look at those underlying dynamics and also acknowledge that the relationships between the problem and the cause are indirect and not obvious. And so this brings us to another practice, especially when we get into the accountability. But before I introduce kind of the different layers of accountability, perhaps thinking about how our institutions are really set up often for blame, right? So for instance, the level of problem analysis, an event happens, and often we, will blame an individual. Or sometimes when I start working with groups, they say, well, it's a couple bad apples, right? Let's figure out how to hold those bad apples accountable, right? And so it's like, let's find out who made that mistake and point the finger at them. The focus is on the person, who did it, what they did was wrong. There's punishment associated, it's your fault, I'll make you pay for it. This can be subtle, but then also quite real. And then which leads to an outcome of cover-ups and no learning. I won't reveal my mistakes. It's worth not making that risk, right? And so blame in our institutions, which tends to be also, it's something in the previous slide, is more aligned with linear thinking. And so when we think about moving to more accountability, we really focus on the system as well. It's everything in our system and structures that are increasing the likelihood of that event or person, right? And so the problem is what happened here? What is unfolding and manifesting here? It's often not just that one person, right? Also, you focus on performance. Let's see what we need to do to get the results that we want, to become more informed, to become more, anti-racist, or to become more, inclusive, to become more diverse and have equity, right? What can we do? And then there's an openness to learning. I want to talk about this, either a mistake or event or thing that happened. And we can all learn something to do the job better next time, right? And so the accountability models are important to consider. And so when we think about accountability in deeply hierarchical structures, and often in predominantly white institutions as well, there's this hierarchical accountability. There's a carrot and a stick. There's punishment and or there's reward and a threat of punishment. It's managed by command and control, and it's top-down management. This type of accountability is mostly appropriate for tasks or roles that people, that have tasks that have a significant potential for risk, right? Administering the right medication to a patient or following the right protocol. On the right-hand side is when we want to build a culture of accountability as a practice, right? So this could be self-accountability, so practice of taking responsibility for our actions and the consequences of those actions. And then there's mutual accountability, which is the practice of using an explicit enforcement mechanism. This could happen in meetings, it could happen on the wards, it could happen with your teaching teams, right? That allow either dyads, people, or teams to hold those who have made commitments or still need to make commitments responsible for following through. We're not going to perpetuate harm. We're going to name when microaggressions happen. We're going to talk about it. So it's the mechanism that holds us all accountable, or the person who wants to do that, for addressing microaggressions, right? And then community accountability is the practice of creating communal support for those impacted. So what happens when racial and ethnic minority faculty or underrepresented in medicine folks are impacted? Do you collectively interrupt what's happening? You challenge, stop, you shift the abusive behavior and the underlying systems that support it? What happens when harm is done? Even if the harm is microaggressions or behaviors that are happening in our environment. And this is most appropriate when addressing or building this practice of accountability is appropriate for addressing racism within ourselves, in our relationships with each other, and also in our communities. So I just want to walk through, and my slides will be available so you could take this, or if you want to screenshot, if you're super inclined and motivated. But when we think about self-accountability, here are some general questions that we can ask, and you can, share with people and even have a conversation with yourself about it, right? So how often do you say or do something, right, that is rooted in a racist attitude, assumption, and stereotypes? And then what emotional response does it bring up for you? What intellectual response does it do? And how often do you acknowledge and name it? And when people point it out, what are your behavioral impulses? Right? And so that's just a self-reflection that anyone can do. I frankly think that it's great for everyone to do. So I invite anyone who wants to engage in some self-accountability and thinking about self-reflecting on that, taking ownership for your own actions. And then I've tailored some questions specifically for faculty, really thinking about in what ways do your racial and cultural background influence how I experience or you experience the world, and what you emphasize in your teaching, and how you evaluate and interpret others and their experiences. And the question that I always like to ask folks is, how do you know? How do you know that that is the ways in which that your racial and cultural background has influenced how you teach? How do you know? Have people told you, or is this something that you feel organically? Like, how do you know? And then one of the other questions the highlighted questions is, how do I address, or you address, offensive and discriminatory comments or microaggressions in clinical learning environment? What do you do to hold yourself accountable for whatever that is, right? And so that these are just some self-reflection questions for faculty as you think about your learning environment. And now I want to talk a little bit about the mutual accountability, which really challenges team members or groups of people to move beyond defensiveness and really to focus on the effects of their behavior. This is instead of hiding behind the proclaimed good intentions, and then we seek to repair that harm. And this is why it's a practice. It really requires that commitment for putting relationships ahead of the need to be right. So what does this look like? And these are some questions that you could engage your teaching team with. In what ways do we name harmful patterns and behaviors in the moment or even after? Do we practice vulnerability and honesty? Are we open to feedback without getting defensive when things happen? Do we interrupt dominant cultural patterns and norms that reinforce white supremacy? And do we prevent their replication? Are we proactive about reaching out to those most affected people of color, rather than waiting for them to come to individuals or teams? And to what extent do we strike a balance between speaking up and stepping back and letting others lead or talk or contribute? And one way to also do this, and so this is a model that was actually adapted to responding microaggressions in classrooms here at Sinai. I know that there are a couple of groups that and departments and places who are using this. Not sure if any of you have seen this. But you can instill this action practice where it's steps that you can take in a group when things happen, like microaggressions, or when events happen as it relates to racism or any chronic social ism, right? All the isms, they are all interconnected. And so you can, when something happens, you can ask clarifying questions. You can become curious, we can encourage the conversation. You can tell what we observe specifically and use the details. I noticed that you blank, 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 and it made me pause. Discuss the impact or the potential impact that it had. I'm concerned that may be hurtful or misconstrued. And then we move into owning our thoughts. You know, the comment makes me feel uncomfortable. And next steps, consider saying, thanks so much for, talking this through with me. Right. And this is when you can start building that practice within teams so that when something happens, it is addressed. It's named, and it goes through a process that is can restore harm, but then also is bringing it up. So we're not letting it just fester or be there in the environment. And this is what we mean by looking at those patterns and really being able to change the patterns that perhaps continue on. Last but not least are really the community accountability. And so this is when a network of people, it could be all of you, right, can develop and practice community accountability. And what would that look like? How can you develop sustainable strategies to address community members' abusive behaviors, creating a process for them? This is beyond just reporting, which I want to acknowledge this. It's really important that when there are events that need to be reported, those should be reported. And what I find normally when I'm talking to departments or students or faculty, there's a lot of other behaviors that are not, quote unquote, that people feel reportable, but are happening. And so one of the things is then what? What then gets done, right? And so can you develop sustainable strategies to address the abusive behaviors or behaviors that are happening and creating a process for them to account for their actions and transform their behaviors? And that's that community accountability, that ongoing development and commitment, safety and support for those. So it's not just being reactive or responding to events and behaviors, but it's also being proactive, ongoing, and negotiating among everyone in the community. So that's when it becomes a practice. So I think I'm going to stop there. Open it up for a conversation because I want to give enough time. And I would love to hear your reactions to this. You know, what came up for you, what resonates, what are things that are like, no, 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 no. So would love to open it up. Let's see if there's any questions in the chat.
So far, we just have Dr. Dua saying goosebumps. Everyone is muted. Yeah, we are going to allow people to unmute today. So Francine, you can unmute. Yeah, everyone is unmuted. So please, Dr. Dua.
Hi, thank you so much, Leona. I just was at the edge of my seat listening to everything you said. Thank you so much for this. You know, the action plan infographic you have is amazing. But the thing that really I'm afraid of is my own curiosity and questioning action could be perceived as another microaggression. Mm-hmm. And so I have a hard time negotiating that.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. So one, I think what's really great about that action, whether you use that or not, or, I mean, you can also just do it organically and say, like, how do we want, when things come up, or, you know, how do we want to be in, relationship with each other? And those are just steps. But I also think that the other thing is naming whatever that fear is. So you could say, I actually, when I lean into curiosity, or when I ask questions, I feel as if I'm making more microaggressions. Would you be okay? And the curiosity isn't asking about like the person, but it is saying like, what did you mean by that? Right? Often we, and I know that I've misconstrued what people have said because of my own biases. And I'm like, look, I'm a New Yorker, raised, I was born and raised, or not born, but I was raised in New York. I have this particular worldview. I went to private school, like all these different things. And I have to own that that's my orientation to the world. And so I know that those are my biases and I can own that. And so I want to know, I'm curious about what you meant by that, because maybe I also have misconstrued it or it's offensive to me. And I want to let you know that this is the impact based on my worldview. So yeah, but name it. We all have anxiety over this. So it's normal. And part of that is to also say, I just want to own that. Is asking more questions going to feel like a microaggression? Would you be open to a conversation? And you could do that as an individual, and you can also do that in teams too. Like teams can build the capacity to do this work.
Thank you. Thank you for that. One other comment I wanted to make was, for some of us, we're very hardwired. So I am an EFTJ. I'm very hardwired for vertical thinking. I'm a supervisor. I can execute plans like nobody else you would know. So actually, it's really hard for me to do the lateral thinking exercise because it's not in my DNA. So it's very much out of my comfort zone. So instead of trying to develop skills that are very, very, I don't have a natural flair for, could I just call upon my INFP friends that for me and I do the execution because that is my superpower. So I would love to hear your thoughts about somebody who absolutely has in their DNA this crushing inability to have lateral thinking.
I know. So one, I'm sure that thinking has literally benefited you in many, many ways. And so own that, love that. Like you said, you can execute things. It's amazing. And that is great. And I would say that if you could develop a practice, maybe also find your other people who think more like you, and for people who think differently, to come together and create a little bit of a community with each other and say, like, how do we do this? So opposed to abdicating it to someone else, although in the beginning, if it's something that you want to do because you want to kind of see how it's done, or, somebody's going to model how to do it, an activity that's a little bit more in the lateral thinking realm or the systems thinking, feel free to employ them. And I would say that this is something that we could perhaps build a muscle and start doing as well, especially because it's needed to address racism.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Hi, Dr. Hess. So I'm a rheumatologist, so we do lateral thinking. I'm just kidding. She's my friend. And we're not very good at executing, right? Anyway, no, so I just want to say that what you said really resonated, and I want to thank you for that. I feel like I've been on the receiving end of microaggressions growing up in France, and I've also fallen short myself. I've probably offended people. I know I have in my life, and that's been a bit paralyzing in terms of trying to solve a bigger issue like this. But I feel like you've empowered me to think, well, even if I have fallen short in the past, I can do better. And I can be part of a solution, but I can't do it by myself. Hopefully others are buying into this ideal and we'll do it together. Anyway, that's all I wanted to say. That's what I got from this talk, and I want to thank you.
Oh, thank you. And I do think it is easier if you do find community about this. Yes, you can have, yourself or personal accountability where you can, constantly, finding out where your biases are showing up, right? Like that's an important practice, especially when you're in learning environments, right? Like your worldview is, I know for some this might be like, what are you saying? But it's subjective. Like it is based on your education, your lived experiences, kind of what has led you to this moment. And that deeply influences how you relate to the people who are in your teaching team, in your teams. Or in your groups or, wherever. So find people that you feel comfortable with and figure out how you can either do some of the thinkings or that mutual and community accountability.
Other comment or questions? I do like, Leona, how you centered this in the complex adaptive systems theory, right, which is a social science theory. And it sort of gets to what Sakshi was saying. We're so trained in sort of the medical model that it becomes challenging to sort of think through that. And so it really takes developing our muscle around that to think that through. And I really appreciate you sort of centering this in that, because I think we all would agree that we are living in a complex model for sure.
And in fact, all of my non-medical friends, they are such creative thinkers, and I definitely surround myself with them because that's how I grow, because it's totally out of the box thinking. So, people who work in NGOs or nonprofits, there's a lot of creative thinking going on there all the time. So it's I like your point, Leona, that just surrounding ourselves with people who are not exactly like us is actually very important, especially in this work.
Yeah, and I actually think there are also a lot of, MDs who are also very creative. Like a lot of the originators of some of this work were physicians, right? So I also want to acknowledge that although I think that there's this dominant narrative for sure, and the education supports vertical, we know that through and through. It's been researched. We know that, and I think it's resonating for people too. It isn't just about research, but that the vertical thinking is so dominant. But there are lots, and I think that a lot of, if you think about your own practice, when it's complex health conditions, you do employ more lateral thinking. You do it, right? You may not be identifying it or naming it or saying "Ooh, now I turned on my lateral thinking brain and I'm thinking about the complexity or the connectivity of things or the systems of things." So I do think that it's around in a lot of. And so, I mean, I don't know if there's any lateral MDs on this call, but speak up too.
I think geriatricians are lateral MDs. But I think what you mentioned, Leona, it makes me think that we need to do this more and more with our trainees, and move them from that vertical conclusions that we've been always encouraging, by nature, as some of the folks have mentioned.
Yeah, I've seen some there's this one article that looks at employing more lateral thinking, doing case examples. So it's mostly in UME, but I'll see if there's something in GME. And so what you do is that you actually kind of tolerate or allow the group or the learning team group to really explore way more kind of possibilities than coming. So you delay the getting to what the diagnosis is, and then you go through a process of asking questions and inquiry so that people really develop that skill set of that lateral thinking and brainstorming of all of the different. So it's using a case example to do this particular methodology, and they find that I should really try to look for that. I found it a couple of years ago and found it fascinating of how how can you, in your existing structures of case presentation or using cases, and how you can kind of employ more of that thinking. So if I can find it again, I'll send it to folks too. Anything else?
I was allowing the silence to see if we could get some more people to comment before we end. Well, I'm glad that everybody stayed today. It was a really great conversation, Leona. It was absolutely terrific for you to help us think more about how we can address racism, not only in our our own situations, but also in the complex system that is our academic institutions, where we know that it exists, as you showed us some of the data. So really appreciate you coming and spending the hour with us. So thank you very much, Leona.
Thank you very much.
Great. Have a nice day, everybody.
Everybody.
Thank you.